Right, wonderful. As y'all heard, I am Daphne Leroy. I am Vice President of Ad Sales Strategy at ViacomCBS. And it's such a pleasure to be spending part of this morning with Rolddy Leyva, Managing Vice President of Global Diversity, Inclusion, and Belonging for Capital One. Just something to share about Rolddy. He and his team partner with human resources and business leaders to build and advance strategic direction and deployment and alignment of his company's diversity, inclusion, and belonging initiatives. And for those of you who are probably well aware, Capital One has nearly 50,000 associates serving millions of customers from offices around the world. Now, let me share just a few fun facts about Rolddy that are not in his bio. He's a passionate storyteller who studied journalism with a dream of traveling the world. And today, he brings that same passion and purpose to lifting up underrepresented groups in his global role at Capital One. And just a quick reminder for the audience before we get started, please be sure to post your questions in the Q&A section of your Zoom screen. After our chat, we'll be addressing your questions. So now, Rolddy, let's get started. Just please, can you tell us a little bit about yourself? Where did you grow up? And who were your early influences as a kid?
You bet. So first, good morning. Good to be here. Hope all of you are well and that your Friday is a good one and that all of you are safe and healthy. Listen, I find that people's names are the gateways to their stories. And so I'll begin with my name a little bit. It's my first name is Rolddy. It's Irish. My last name, Leyva, is from Spain, and I'm neither Irish nor Spanish, so go figure. But I was born in Cuba. And when I was 5, and my parents at the time were in their mid to late 20s, we boarded a fishing boat, like many Cubans at the time, and fled the island in search of a better tomorrow, which is what brought us to the shores of this great country. And we settled in Miami like many of the Cubans did. This was back in 1980. And listen, if you were a Cuban coming into the United States and living in Miami, it was a really comfortable bubble to be in. You get all the goodness of this country without the hardship of necessarily having to speak the language right away. My mother got a job at JCPenney without knowing English while she studied it, which is the type of opportunity she probably wouldn't have had as much of access to anywhere other than Miami at the time. But what she realized in that process was that immigration in this country was about assimilation more than anything else. And we needed to learn English and be, as she would say, as American as possible. She was always afraid that if we weren't as quote unquote American as possible, that we would be one day sent back to Cuba. So we moved to Orlando, and in Orlando, not too far from Miami, but back then it wasn't much more than a bunch of orange groves, a castle, and a mouse. I went to school with people who look like me. I'm white, but we're very different from me in every other dimension, right? So I took English as a second language courses naturally. I also had a tutor assigned to me to lose my accent as a Latino. My first grade teacher couldn't pronounce my name and suggested I go by Rod. And so when people ask me, when was it that I knew that I wanted to do this work of diversity? It's not that I was in first grade thinking, well, all of this is wrong, and one day I'll be a chief inclusion officer. But that was my first memory of realizing that everything about who I thought I was potentially a liability to my being safe, feeling accepted. And so I adopted this persona of Rod. I poured myself into learning English, into sounding as, again, quote unquote, American as possible. I created this whole new identity and concealed my true identity. And today we know that to be what's called code switching or covering, a burden that so many underrepresented groups have to live with, and especially people of color. I ultimately was able to step into my skin and into my truth, and that allowed me to get into the work I did. You mentioned my passion for journalism. That was informed by this idea of being able to go out and tell people stories and help them step into their truth. And so that is why I do what I do today. My early influences in this work were like really powerful people in media. So I've always had a passion for media and the opportunity that media has to help people see themselves represented in a world where sometimes they can't and they don't. This is probably not a great story to tell, but one of the first memories I have of seeing a Cuban on film was the movie Scarface, which was based on a Cuban, but in fact was played by Al Pacino, who isn't Cuban at all. And so I just, that we couldn't find a Hispanic to play a Hispanic is a fascinating thing, right? And so, and then even that depiction wasn't necessarily a very positive depiction. And so it's been really important for me to focus on representation and the importance of representation and fair and holistic representation of people's identity. Because representation matters and it creates safety. And so that's a little bit about me and sort of what influenced me in getting to where I'm at today.
Well, thanks for sharing, Rolddy, not Rod, but Rolddy. And representation truly does matter. I empathize with your personal journey. My parents emigrated from the Caribbean to the US in the 1960s. So the story you're telling about that immigrant experience is something that so many of us can relate to, and it truly is impacting the work that you are doing. And by the way, you probably have the coolest job title. It's diversity and inclusion and belonging. Can you tell us about how that role came about, and tell us also a little more about the work that you're doing at Capital One?
Yeah, listen, thank you. That's a great question. So the world is changing. It has been changing for some time. I think if 2020 taught us anything, is that it's changing really quickly and that we all need to change with it. And so part of what I look at when I think about why we do this work and how we do this work is what are the things we have, the big complex problems of our past we haven't solved for. And we need to carry those forward. But equally important is, where is the world going? What are the big complex problems of the future that we need to be thinking about? And how do we pivot our strategy and our focus to begin to solve for those things before they, to get ahead of those things before they become real problems? And so, the language of diversity and inclusion, D&I as an example, and a lot of the programming around D&I is fairly, it is work that has effectively sort of been reprogrammed, iterated on over the last 30, 40, 50 plus years. And there's goodness in that because, again, 2020 taught us anything is that we still haven't solved for the big complex problems of race and gender equity and other pieces. But I think that there's more to the work that connects all of us to it. Diversity is a fact. It's just representation. It's who we are. It's identity. Everyone is diverse. Inclusion is a choice. It's a decision that is made on whether or not someone is included in something, in context. And it's a choice that is often made by the person including versus the person needing to be included. So there's already privilege in that equation. But to me, belonging is the impact of all that intent. So if inclusion is intent, belonging is the impact. Belonging is a sentiment, is the way we feel about in the context and climate that we're in. All of us, no matter what our identity is, all of us can remember a time where we haven't belonged and what that feels like, and also know what belonging needs to feel like and should feel like and connect to it. And so it is a universal concept. It transcends all people. It is directly connected to humanity. And so the way in which I think it brings us all into the work, and the way that it is sort of universal in its acceptance and understanding, and frankly, the way in which it is entirely about how folks are feeling on the back end of all of this intent, that should be our North Star. That is why we focus on it. You cannot have belonging unless you have the right representation, the right inclusive principles and actions, the right fair and equitable systems. And if you have all those things, you have belonging. So that makes it our North Star. And that's why we anchor ourselves to that.
So well said, Rolddy. Belonging is impact, inclusion is intent, and belonging is the impact of that work. And we know that we're living in difficult times, and we stand in solidarity with the AAPI community now more than ever, along with all communities of color. And we know that communities of color are experiencing disproportionate levels of challenges. We're living in dual pandemic, racism, and COVID-19. So can you tell us a little bit about how Capital One is responding to these numerous challenges across the communities in which you serve?
Okay, yeah, that's a really big question and a lot to unpack there. So first, again, 2020 was an extraordinary year on so many levels, and And you're right to call out the dual pandemics, COVID-19 and also the pandemic of racism. And that's been here and around the world, and all of us have been impacted by them. I also want to take a moment to acknowledge, and because it is connected, and a little bit of the point that you started to make there, we're in the middle of Women's History Month. And I also reflect on the work that we must continue to do to ensure, just, equitable, and inclusive outcomes for women. And then especially women of color who are disproportionately advantaged and who are often overlooked. And that brings me to to the recent attacks that we saw play out in Atlanta, where 6 of the 8, or in Georgia, not just Atlanta, but in Georgia, and where 6 of the 8 victims were Asian women. And there's a lot of debate right now about whether or not it's a hate crime. And I think that's, listen, while we wait for law enforcement to declare it a hate crime, you just can't ignore the fact that 6 of the 8 victims were Asian women. Asian women for whom racism and sexism have always been intertwined. And that is, I would say that is probably true of all women of color. And so, for them and for so many women of color, this racism takes the form of unwanted sexual harassment, which is often overtly racist. And while, interestingly enough, while most victims of violent hate crimes are men, there was a recent analysis of the 3,800 or so hate crimes against Asian and Pacific Islanders that have happened since 2020. And more than 2/3 of those have been reported by women. And so, listen, this just brings me back to your question, the challenges of the times that we're in, right? There's a lot of work left for us to do in building social consciousness and awareness, but then also action to combat what we're seeing playing out in the world around us. Safety emerges for me as a powerful common denominator here. Whether we're talking about the health pandemic or the race pandemic, it's all about safety on some dimension. And safety is at the heart of belonging, which is why we've declared that as our North Star. So when I focus specifically on the diversity elements of the world that we're living in right now, the racial justice piece, the gender equity piece, et cetera. And I reflect back on the killing of George Floyd on May 25th. We're approaching the 1-year anniversary soon. Capital One's response against these attacks on our Black and Brown sisters and brothers has been swift, it's been bold, it's been decisive, it's been broad. I'll share a few highlights. A few days after the killing of George Floyd, we hosted a town hall. It came together in the span of 1 week. You mentioned earlier we have 50,000 associates, and I remember our leadership was wondering, how many folks might log into this thing with only 1 week to promote it, and I was hoping we might get 5,000 people plug in. Well, 24,000 people joined it. We were able to get half the company, which is just, again, a testament to the amount of just the opportunity there was to have really deep, important, raw dialogue. And that's what it was. It was open, honest, raw discussion on the real lived experiences of Black people at work and in the world around us. We ended up hosting 4 separate events over the span of about 3 months. Altogether, over 60,000 associates plugged into our discussions on race. We have since launched a number of commitments focused on advancing a culture of belonging and racial equity and inclusion at work and in our communities. They include required anti-racism education for all of our 600 plus executives by the end of this year. We early on at the height of the Black Lives Matter movement, we invested $10 million to support racial equity and inclusion in our communities in support of the movement. We have since launched a $200 million impact initiative to improve access and equity in our communities for Black and Brown people in particular. We are investing in and supporting Black-owned small businesses and suppliers. And so we're looking at the world holistically. We think we have 3 roles that we play, right? We are a business, a destination for employment, and a corporate citizen. And our focus is in ensuring we're making deep impact as much as we can and helping to kind of affect societal change in the world around us, both at work and in those spaces that we play in.
Well, indeed, deep impact, and the forum, the dialogue that you're fostering, again, goes back to your passion around storytelling. It truly plays a major role in how you're building community and connections not only across your company, but with your consumers and suppliers. Can you talk a little more about the impact you think storytelling has played in the work that you're doing?
Yeah, since the dawn of time, we have been connected by story. It's how we first started communicating, and it has brought us together. Stories of grit and adversity, and resilience and overcoming. And this is why I love the work that all of you do, because it is about connecting to people through story. And so I do think that that storytelling is a powerful vehicle to build connection, and through that connection you build community, and then through that community you're able to advance. You're able to get farther and go quicker. There's an old African proverb that goes, if you want to go fast, you go alone. To go far, you go together. And so this idea of community and being in motion together is really important. And it's the only way that we're going to be able to make the changes we want to see in the world around us. I think the way that we've come together as a global community to combat a common foe of COVID-19 is an example of the goodness and the capability of humanity and what we're able to do. And we have all been touched by, or at least I have, by the stories of people tragically who have lost their lives because of the pandemic, but also the stories of people coming together to support one another, to help folks who don't have access to vaccination sites to get them. Just the number of volunteers who are out there administering vaccines and getting the word out. That's an example of the goodness of humanity and people coming together as community, and stories compel us to connect to these things. And so when I reflect on my work of belonging, it is essential. Diversity, this work cannot just be data, facts, numbers, business case, programming. It can't just live in the head. Otherwise, you lose the connection to humanity and it's not going to create the change you seek. And so for me, I think storytelling is the way to the heart of this work, to the humanity of it. And once you have that, you're able to build endurance through the programming.
Well, on that note, Rolddy, I want to bring it back to this audience, as you know, comprised of brand marketers and who have expressed interest in truly advancing this narrative and work around diversity, inclusion, and belonging and storytelling, because as you know, it's not just important to connect, but to do it authentically and accurately. So through the lens of a diversity, inclusion, and belonging thought leader, what words of wisdom or inspiration do you have for our audience in terms of how they do this authentically, building empathy and inspiring action?
Yeah. Gosh, so I would say this, as professionals in your field, you are positioned to advance the reach and reputation of your brands within diverse communities, really within all communities. I would say today, and particularly maybe more than ever, as certainly as I reflect on my own career, consumers are looking for more than just a nice website and catchy messaging. They want to see impact and equity. They want to see themselves represented. They want to see authenticity. It's not about a checklist of tactics for increasing representation and marketing. It's about authenticity and letting organic storytellers share our purpose-driven mission and our values. And so we don't focus on a single story or point of view or storyteller. Our approach is to authentically share many points of view to shape the message of our associates' real life and their experiences at Capital One. It's how we approach our marketing. It's how I would, it's what resonates with me when I think about other sort of examples of organizations that have done this work well. And so I think the key is understanding your market, understanding the nuances of your market. Women are not monolithic. Hispanics are not monolithic. Asians are not monolithic. It is nuanced. People have different needs and are living different experiences. Be thoughtful to those, acknowledge those, and your ability to understand and connect by way of how you tell your stories through your products and your marketing. I think will serve you well across those three dimensions. Because it's not, if you're able to connect on one that way, and I talked earlier about your three roles as a business, as a destination for employment, and as a corporate citizen. People are savvy and they're scrutinizing and they're looking at you across all those dimensions. And so your ability to do one must also mirror the way that you're doing the others. If you have a great marketing message that is focused on the nuances of women of color, but you haven't developed your own women of color as a destination for employment, folks are going to know that, they'll know that and see through that. So I just think it's important to be really integrated in that ecosystem and work with your teams internally to ensure that when you tell that message, when you tell that story and deliver that message, that those values are lived across those three different roles that you all play.
And Rolddy, on that point, when you said the communities that we're serving, multicultural communities, are not monolithic groups, can you tell us a little bit about how the power of storytelling, especially for this audience of brand marketers, again, need to bear that in mind, really understanding the uniqueness of the communities, and you more than anyone understands those nuances and those specific approaches when it comes to ensuring that your employees and the consumers you serve feel as though they're being spoken to and brought in an authentic way.
Yeah, so are you looking specifically for techniques that they might want to use, or just things to do?
Just in terms of your general approach, you don't often hear someone even acknowledge that multicultural communities are not monolithic groups. So I was just curious to know if you might want to unpack that a little bit, just as part of the importance we're making around storytelling in terms of the DIB work you're doing.
Oh yeah, so specifically in terms of my space.
Right.
Oh, got it. Okay, good. That's the connection. Yeah, listen, I think that that requires a lot of intentionality. I speak on college campuses every now and then, and I often ask, graduating folks who are about to graduate. I talk about the workplace they're about to enter, and I talk about this thing called diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging. And we give examples of some of the programming. One of the ones I speak often about is you're going to enter a workplace that has these things called business resource groups or employee resource groups. And there's one for women, and there's one for Black, and there's one for Hispanic or Latinx. And we give examples of what they look like. And I ask, how many of you would be willing to join those? And the majority actually don't raise their hands. And there's a lot more diversity in the classroom than there ever has been, right? More women in undergraduate in particular. And advanced degrees as well, more people of color. And so these rooms are diverse, and yet these programs don't resonate. And when I ask why, the most common answer is they feel too exclusive and too narrow. I'm not just Latino. I'm a Latino man who also identifies as gay, who also has an age and generation attached to it, who also has a socioeconomic status, a faith or an absence of faith, an ability or disability. We all identify across a range of identities. And so I think it is dangerous to begin to put people into one, and we have a tendency as humans to want to do that because it is the shortcut that our brains take. Like, what is the simple box that we can just categorize people in? But the world is shifting. None of us identify as one thing anymore, and so it requires intentionality. Our systems haven't caught up to that. So if you look at even as I think about sort of what we are required to report out on in terms of representation and data through EEOC and other agencies, they are still fairly very narrow boxes. And so we have to do the work within organizations to acknowledge the fact that our associates, our employees, are in fact way more diverse than the categories we may have slotted them under before, and provide the space for them to do that. We have been really intentional about self-ID on sexual orientation and on gender identity, on the intersectionality between sexual orientation, gender identity, and race. We know that Black transgender women have a very different experience than transgender women, than Black women, right? So you kind of sort of have to nuance all that and approach it the right way. So that is the muscle that has to, and it's a new muscle for many organizations. That's why these roles are so important and these teams are so important, and why you've seen diversity officers grow exponentially just in the last year, because I think organizations are waking up to the fact that they need this work.
Got it. And Rolddy, it goes back something you said early on in this conversation: inclusion is intent, belonging is impact, right? So given all of your approaches and strategies, that really is the end goal, to ensure that you are making that impact in the work that you're doing. So in closing, I also wanted to pick on a point you made about during this transformational year that we've had, the power of humanity, right? And how that truly is a common thread and a driver in the work that you do each day. Can you speak a little more about how that truly is part of your passion and purpose in the work that you're doing for Capital One?
Yeah, I just get so, it's interesting. I heard someone recently talk about, well, I heard someone recently asked whether they were optimistic for the future. And their response really resonated with me. The answer was no, that they were not optimistic about the future. And he went on to explain that the reason why is because the world has become so unpredictable. No one could have predicted 2020 as an example, and that was just a year ago. And so, but that there was a difference between optimism and hope. And that he very much is hopeful for the future. And the difference, the way that he defined it was, optimism is an opinion. It's a state of mind. But hope is a spur to action. It's a state of being or a state of action. And so I think it's easy to feel down on the future when we've lived through what we've lived through as a connected society these past 13, 14 months in particular. But I have incredible hope for the world that for the future because of what I know us to be. And I think our response to COVID is an example of that, right? I talked about it earlier. It's the first time in my memory that I have seen the world come together as it has, sharing knowledge, sharing information, sharing people, to combat a common foe. And there's such goodness in that when we can break down borders and walls and just connect on the experience, on the human experience. So I have a lot of hope that as we're not going to return to the normal we had. We are emerging into a new normal. And by the way, I hope part of that new normal is that we find more balance in how we bring the humanity that we have found by way of Zoom into our workplaces again. I have met more people's spouses and partners and children and family and dogs and cats and pets, iguanas even, during these Zoom calls that I would never have met in a regular meeting. And it has created these moments of levity and humanity that just remind us what it's all about. One of my most memorable meetings was with our head of people leadership, and we were having a really deep discussion on performance management and how we care for our talent this was last year, during the height of the pandemic, and create the space to care for them. And we're just talking about different options. And suddenly this young boy dressed up in full-on Spider-Man gear just like shows up behind her, and he starts like flinging makeup webs at the screen. And she's so intently focused on the conversation. So I'm seeing him, she doesn't know he's there. And so it takes her a second to see him on the screen. And it was just the thing we needed. And so then I got to meet her nephew, who was Spider-Man. And to this day, we still joke about it. So anyway, it's a tactical, tiny example of the importance of humanity, to kind of remind ourselves of all the goodness that we have and what we're capable of. And I'm hopeful for that. And so that is the thing that I anchor back to, and why, again, belonging is so essential to the work that we're doing.
Well, Rolddy, hearing more about the work that you do truly makes us all even more hopeful for the future. I got a cue from the producers that we're wrapping our session a few minutes early, but before we do, wanted to know if there's anything else you'd like to add and impart on today's audience.
No, listen, I guess my main closing thought was I just wish all of you good health, and thank you all for joining, and hope all of you have a restful weekend.
Well, thank you all. Rolddy, thank you so much. I really enjoyed this time with you, and want to thank everyone at Brand Innovators, and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you. Bye.